Hey folks, welcome back to My Kitten Reads. I'm Eleanor and this is a very quick video for the end of the year because I've just finished a book and I have some thoughts, small thoughts that I kind of wanted to talk about. I'm holding my iPhone in my hand. I'm sitting in the cabin at the back of Mum and Dad's place where I've been staying. As you can see, all of Mum's collection of children's books is behind me. But yeah, I have finished rereading this book, which is probably going to look backwards because that's the way the camera's switched backwards. But it's The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin. This book is essentially a novella. It's like 128 pages. It won a Hugo Award. I can't remember what year. I think it might have been the late 60s or early 70s. Anyway, so I've read this previously, and at the time that I read it, it was sort of one of the most gut-punching, confronting explorations of colonialism I'd ever come across in science fiction, which for an Australian with a tiny bit of Indigenous heritage way back in my family tree, and particularly coming from like Tasmania, where colonization didn't just end with the Black War, to the point where a lot of people, even in Australia, still think that Truganini was the last Indigenous Tasmanian, which is not true. Anyway, so that's how I read it. But this time round, when I read it, I read the introduction, which I didn't read the first time that I read the book. And the thing is, Le Guin, when she wrote this, was in a very different context. She was protesting the Vietnam War. I believe she was spending some time essentially on her own in England, and so it was a bit of a fish out of water. But that's the context she was writing in. So that was what was in her head, the violence of basically a proxy war in Vietnam. She wasn't actually really thinking about colonization as a form of violence. But that's still how I read it. It's still very much how I read it. Like a lot of the tactics and thoughts used by the colonizing force in The Word for World is Forest is very reminiscent of the Vietnam War, like the firebombing, that kind of stuff. But I think in the end, even though her context is very different from my context in reading it, the point is the same. And the point of the story is that when one culture invades or colonizes another culture and brings violence, then there is no escaping the damage that does to the culture that was invaded. Even in this case, where the invaded culture ends up winning as we would call it, they are very aware that this concept of murder, of killing, has been brought into their culture because they use it to fight back. But the character of Selva, who is the one that led the fight back, the one who brought this concept out of their dream time into their world time, is he's very aware at the end in the epilogue that there's no going back from this. He cannot go back from what he has done, and his culture will unlikely, even if they're left alone, they can't go back. They can't go back because the concept is there. And that is essentially the damage and the trauma of colonization. That trauma, that damage those concepts that didn't previously exist are there, and they have infiltrated the culture. And the culture will be forever changed. You can't go through something like that without being changed. There's no putting the genie back in the box. But yeah, so it was a very good read. Confronting still, like a lot of the language was really difficult for me to deal with. But it was required to make the point that Le Guin was making. Or that I was at least taking out of what she was saying. So I would, thoroughly recommend The Word for World is Forest by Ursula Le Guin, but also would say, content warnings. There's a lot of violence. There are a lot of mentions of rape, although I don't think any rapes actually happen on screen, but they are definitely spoken about. So it's not in any way, it's a traumatic read, a confronting read, but I think a very worthwhile read, even for a novella that has been around for like 50 years, something like that. Definitely worth rereading, and definitely worth other people reading if they can get a hold of it. Anyway, that's probably my last video for the year. I still have another 4 books or something that I have to finish in order to reach my goal. So that's going to be fun. But I will see you again really soon. Bye.